The most dangerous battles inside a palace are not fought with swords or armies. They are fought with papers, with signatures, and with the quiet, cold precision of someone who knows exactly where the bodies are buried. This is a story about one of those battles. It's a fictional tale inspired by royal themes, but it is not real. It is not confirmed. It is a dramatized story about power, about family, and about the moment a quiet princess decided she had to take control. Imagine a midnight meeting. A woman walks into another woman's private chambers. She drops a thick file on the table, and she tells her with no emotion in her voice that she is no longer in charge. The strange part isn't the confrontation itself. The strange part is that the king signed the order before it even happened. He gave his sister temporary absolute power over everything inside the castle, and then he just sat in his study while she carried it out. That is not a family disagreement. That is a palace coup with proper paperwork. The princess who did this has spent decades being the person nobody writes headlines about. She does not give interviews about her feelings. She does not try to be famous. She just shows up, does her duty, and apparently also conducts secret investigations into property management in her spare time. And that is where this whole story begins. She heard a rumor about some strange changes happening with the castle estate management, some kind of new approach to leases. Instead of sending a strongly worded email or waiting for a committee meeting, she went to the records room at dawn and started digging. She physically went there with a thermos of tea and started cross-referencing ancient land deeds against current contracts. That is such a classic move from this princess. Everyone else is having hushed conversations in the corridors, and she is in a windowless room deep in the royal archives, wearing a simple jumper, building a legal case. What she found is where the real contradiction sits. The queen's team, meaning the staff working for the current queen, had been pushing through changes to how the castle properties were managed. They were reclassifying historic parts of the estate as commercial assets. Now that might sound like boring administrative shuffling, but here's why it matters. When something is classified as a historic heritage asset, it has layers of protection and oversight. There are traditional committees that have to sign off on changes. There are preservation standards. There's a whole system designed to make sure nobody can just decide to turn a protected cottage into an event space because they think it would generate revenue. But if you quietly reclassify that same property as a commercial asset, suddenly those protections do not apply in the same way. You can negotiate leases differently. You can bring in outside contractors. You can make decisions with a much smaller circle of approval. And that is exactly what the princess found. A small, hand-picked group operating under the current administration was making decisions that bypassed the traditional oversight entirely. This is the part where we have to pause, because if that is true, then the whole argument about modernization falls apart in a very specific way. Modernization is not the same thing as removing oversight. You can modernize processes while still maintaining checks and balances. You can update systems without reclassifying protected assets so they do not get the same scrutiny. The fact that the princess found verbal agreements that held no legal weight but were being treated as binding contracts suggests this was not about efficiency. It was about control. If you are confident your changes are good for the institution, you document them properly. You present them to the traditional councils. You build consensus. You do not rely on informal handshake deals that would not hold up if anyone ever asked to see the paperwork. And that brings us to the situation with a certain royal residence, which is where this whole thing found its most explosive pressure point. The public story around that residence has mostly focused on one man and the mounting maintenance costs and whether he should be living there. But the princess looked at that situation and saw something entirely different. She saw the Queen's office granting unauthorized concessions on property leases, offering reduced rents and flexible terms, trying to resolve what was essentially a public relations problem through private negotiations that completely sidestepped the traditional oversight committees. From the Queen's perspective, this probably seemed like a practical solution. Get the mess sorted quietly, keep the family drama out of the headlines, show the king that she could handle a difficult situation efficiently. But from the princess's perspective, and this is where her thinking is genuinely hard to argue against, you cannot set a precedent where crown property rights become private bargaining chips. Because once you do that for one property, you have opened the door for every other arrangement to be questioned. The public's trust in how royal assets are managed is not based on whether the outcomes are convenient. It is based on whether the process is legitimate. So the princess compiled her dossier, 60 pages of detailed, annotated evidence. She did not write an opinion piece. She attached copies of original land grants and put them side by side with the recent altered contracts. She documented how small, seemingly harmless changes to maintenance contracts were being used to bypass committees that had existed for generations. She proved that the reclassification of heritage assets was happening without proper authorization. And then she hand-delivered it to the Queen's private secretary and said she expected a formal response within 48 hours. That is not a request for dialogue. That is an audit with a deadline. Now here's where the story takes a turn that makes the whole situation feel less like a disagreement and more like a complete collapse of the Queen's administrative authority. The Queen's team went into what staff described as panic mode after reading the first 10 pages. Not because the princess had found gossip or embarrassing personal details, but because she had found the structural weaknesses in their entire strategy. They tried to draft a rebuttal, but they hit a wall. They could not refute the facts. The documents were right there. The original charter said one thing, the new contract said another, and there was no paper trail showing how they got from point A to point B. That is not a philosophical difference about tradition versus progress. That is an administrative failure that anyone who has ever worked in compliance or governance would recognize immediately. The thing that keeps coming back is how avoidable this all was. If the Queen's team had simply run their changes through the proper channels from the beginning, even if those channels were slow and frustrating and full of traditionalists who would push back, they would have had a defensible position. They could have said, look, we followed the process. We built consensus. These changes were approved through legitimate means. Instead, they tried to move faster than the system allowed. And when the princess started pulling on the threads, the whole thing unraveled. That timeline does not add up if you're trying to argue this was just normal modernization. Normal modernization leaves a paper trail. Normal modernization does not involve verbal agreements that carry no legal weight. Normal modernization does not panic when someone asks to see the documentation. And this is where the clash of philosophies becomes genuinely interesting. The princess represents something very specific. She is not just a traditionalist who dislikes change on principle. She is someone who believes the monarchy's power comes from its continuity, from the fact that it has endured because it does not remake itself every generation based on whoever happens to be in charge. Her view is that the castle estate is not a portfolio of assets to be optimized. It is a trust. It belongs to the institution, not to whoever currently occupies the throne. And if you start treating it like a commercial enterprise, you might get short-term financial wins, but you are eroding the very thing that makes it worth protecting in the first place. The Queen's team operates on a completely different frequency. They see empty cottages as wasted opportunities. They see revenue potential in event spaces and modernized leases. They speak the language of market valuations and strategic asset management. And honestly, that is not an unreasonable perspective if you're genuinely worried about the long-term financial sustainability of the monarchy. The problem is not that they wanted to modernize. The problem is that they apparently tried to do it in a way that bypassed the safeguards that exist specifically to prevent short-term thinking from damaging long-term assets. The king's position in all of this is genuinely hard to read. He is the person who signed the order giving his sister temporary absolute authority over castle operations. That is not a small thing. That is a direct repudiation of his wife's administrative approach. And he did it after the princess presented her findings, which means he looked at the evidence and concluded that the risks she identified were real enough to warrant a complete reversal of the modernization agenda. But then he just retreated to his study and went silent. He did not make a public statement. He did not try to mediate between the two sides. He signed the order and removed himself from the process entirely. Some of the older courtiers think this was strategic. They believe the king is letting his sister do the brutal work of house cleaning so he does not have to bear the personal cost. By staying silent, he keeps his hands clean. The princess becomes the enforcer, the one who locked down the administrative wing and dismissed the queen's staff and terminated the outside contracts. The king remains the benevolent figure who simply had to make a difficult decision for the good of the institution. If that is true, it is either cold-blooded genius or a sign that he genuinely could not figure out another way to resolve the situation without destroying his marriage entirely. What happened after the midnight meeting is almost more revealing than the meeting itself. By early morning, the administrative wing was cordoned off. The security team that moved in did not come from the local castle detail. They were veteran officers, many of whom had served during the previous reign. The princess brought in her own people, people whose loyalty was to the traditional structure, not to the current administration. They started demodernizing the office protocols immediately. The digital booking systems were shut down and replaced with traditional ledger entries. Every file was pulled from the cloud and moved to secure physical storage. They swept the rooms for listening devices and hidden trackers. The Queen's staff were given until the end of the business day to collect their personal items under supervision, and they were not permitted to remove any files, laptops, or internal notes. That is not a transition, that is a seizure. The visual impact was unmistakable. The Queen's team had decorated the wing with modern art and open-plan desks designed to foster collaboration. Within 48 hours, the art was gone and the furniture was replaced with heavy traditional mahogany desks. They were literally scrubbing away the aesthetic of the modernization era. It is such a visceral way of communicating that the experiment is over. You do not just change the policies, you change the furniture. You make it impossible for anyone to walk into that space and think the old approach is still in play. And the Queen herself is now in this strange suspended state. She still has her title and her public duties, but her ability to manage her own schedule, direct her staff, or initiate new projects has been effectively frozen. Anyone who wants to reach her has to go through a security filter. The phrase that keeps getting used is administrative house arrest. She is physically in the castle, but she is cut off from the machinery of her office. The aides she trusted are gone. The contractors she brought in have been terminated. The projects she launched are under review by a committee led by the princess herself. The part that makes this entire situation feel like something out of a historical drama, rather than a modern administrative dispute, is the single handwritten note on the final page of the princess's dossier. It was an order signed by the king granting his sister temporary absolute authority over all internal operations at the castle. The princess did not just show up to that midnight meeting with evidence and arguments. She showed up with a signed document that had already shifted the legal ground beneath the queen's feet. The confrontation was not a negotiation, it was a notification. The decision had already been made. The queen was being informed of her own demotion, and the princess apparently spoke without emotion. She did not get into a debate about the theory of modernization. She kept the conversation grounded in the reality of what the evidence showed. She told the queen that the king had seen the risks and had chosen to prioritize the stability of the institution over his wife's vision. That is an absolutely brutal thing to hear. Not just that you have lost a power struggle, but that your husband looked at your work and decided it was dangerous enough to require intervention. The humiliation in that moment must have been absolute. The ultimatum itself was stark. The queen's direct control over castle estate management would end immediately. All her projects would be placed under review. Her access to the central archive was revoked. Her private staff was dismissed. And here's the threat that makes the whole thing feel final. The princess told her that any further attempts to bypass the new council would result in full public disclosure of the dossier's findings. She was essentially saying, if you try to fight this, the public will see exactly what your team was doing with the crown's protected assets. That is not just a warning. That is a leverage point that makes resistance impossible. The queen cannot push back without risking the very public narrative she spent years trying to cultivate. The broader implications here are genuinely significant for how we understand the monarchy's internal dynamics. The princess has been this silent, reliable bedrock for decades, and now she has demonstrated that when she decides to act, she can effectively neutralize an entire administrative agenda in a matter of weeks. She built the case, presented it to the king, got his signature, and executed a complete takeover before anyone outside the immediate circle even knew what was happening. That is operational competence at a level that most corporate boards would envy. And the king's silence throughout this process raises questions that probably will not be answered for years. Is he genuinely broken by having to choose between his sister and his wife? Or is he quietly relieved that someone else stepped in to fix a problem he could not address directly? The older courtiers who think this is a masterclass in royal endurance might be right. By letting the princess absorb the political cost of dismantling the modernization agenda, he preserves his ability to remain the unifying figurehead. But that strategy only works if his marriage survives being collateral damage. And right now, reports suggest they are living in a marriage that has become a casualty of the institution they both serve. They are not discussing the estate anymore. They are not discussing the future of the monarchy. They are just coexisting in a house where one of them has been stripped of operational power and the other signed the order that made it happen. The staff observe the king with a mixture of reverence and pity now. He spends longer hours staring out at the manicured lawns. He appears less frequently at public ceremonies. He is a man who possesses immense wealth and historical significance, but currently cannot change even the smallest aspect of his own home without it being filtered through his sister's committee. That is a strange, gilded cage. He kept his throne and secured the institution for the next generation, but the cost was the quiet life he had imagined for himself. The question that hangs over all of this is whether the monarchy will actually be stronger for this internal check. On one hand, the princess's intervention stopped a pattern of administrative decisions that were creating genuine structural vulnerabilities. The informal leases, the verbal agreements, the reclassification of heritage assets, all of that was building risk into the system. If it had continued unchecked, the eventual public exposure would have been far more damaging than anything that has happened so far. From that perspective, the princess did exactly what the institution needed. She identified a threat and neutralized it before it could become a crisis. But on the other hand, the way this was handled has created a fracture that might not heal. The queen is still the queen, but she is a queen who was publicly outmaneuvered and stripped of her administrative authority by her own sister-in-law with her husband's approval. That is not the kind of thing you just move past. The family unity that the monarchy relies on for its public performance is now visibly strained in a way that is going to be difficult to hide. Every time the queen appears at a public engagement, there's going to be an awareness that behind the scenes, she is no longer running the show. The power has shifted back to the traditionalist wing, and it has shifted in a way that left no ambiguity about who won. The castle estate itself is now back under the control of the person who knows its history better than anyone else. The digital systems are gone. The modern art is in storage. The outside contractors have been dismissed. The castle has been returned to what the princess would call its sovereign purpose, a space governed by continuity and tradition rather than market logic and efficiency metrics. Whether that makes it stronger or just more resistant to necessary change is the debate that will probably define the next chapter of this family story. What is clear is that the era of polite disagreements is over. The princess did not just challenge a policy. She systematically dismantled an entire administrative apparatus and replaced it with her own people. She used the institution's own rules to trap the very people who were trying to bend them. And she did it with such clinical precision that by the time anyone outside the inner circle understood what was happening, it was already done. The midnight meeting was not the climax of the conflict. It was the victory lap. The real work had already happened in the archives, in the dossier, and in the quiet conversation where the king looked at the evidence and signed his name on the dotted line. The battle for the soul of the monarchy is not just about leases and property maintenance. It is about whether the institution can adapt without losing the foundations that make it worth preserving. And right now, the woman who believes those foundations are non-negotiable is the one holding all the keys.